Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the Catalyst program and Catalyst Launchpad Fireside Chat with Stephanie Wisner. My name is Nate Prorock, and I'll be your host for this evening. This is going to be a lot of fun. We've gotten to know Stephanie pretty well in these last few weeks, and this is going to be a fantastic chat. The Catalyst program is UCSF's Translational Accelerator. We work with students, doctors, faculty to help turn their ideas into products. We do this in many different mechanisms. One is through Catalyst Award funding, as well as expert industry advisor mentorship. The other co-host of this project or this day today is Catalyst Launchpad. Catalyst Launchpad is focused on student and trainee entrepreneurship. So no matter where you are in your journey, if you're going to be a doctor, a scientist, a physician, a nurse, a dentist, the Launchpad is for you in the student and trainee space. Helps meet you where you are and helps train you with the entrepreneurial mindset. So without further ado, now that you've learned a little bit more about the Catalyst program, a little bit about Catalyst Launchpad, it is my great pleasure today to introduce Stephanie Wisner. Stephanie co-founded the biotech startup Centivax, where she is now the Chief Business Officer. She has also advised multiple biotech startups on business and commercialization strategy through her consulting business, BioVenture Advising. Stephanie has spent several years before that at ARC Venture Partners. In 2022, Stephanie was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for healthcare. She completed her MBA at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business with concentrations in finance, accounting, and entrepreneurship. She received her bachelor's degree in chemistry and chemical biology from Cornell University and was awarded the Einhorn Discovery Research Grant for her independent research on cancer. Stephanie's book, Building Backwards to Biotech, and I will put this in the chat soon for everybody, was an Amazon #1 new release in the biotechnology category. The book is currently taught as part of the bioentrepreneurial programming at multiple top institutions, including Dartmouth College, Cornell University, and others. She is an entrepreneur in residence, as well as a faculty member at Cornell University Johnson School of Business. While Stephanie no longer gets much time in the lab, she enjoys travel and continuous learning from all the work that her career involves. So Stephanie, wow, you've done so much already. Congratulations on all your work. Thank you really for being here. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you. You touch on a lot of the different things with what Catalyst program as well as Catalyst Launchpad really focus on. You have a lot of background in science, a lot of background in business, and you seem to be the perfect embodiment of everything that we're going to do. So again, welcome. Thank you for being here, and we're so excited to have you.
Thanks so much, and really excited to be here. Thank you to everyone for listening to that very long paragraph. When I was publishing the book, they asked me to put that together, and they wanted something fun at the end that wasn't about the book. I always forget to take it out when I send it to people. But I guess now you know I like to travel. But in any case, thanks so much for having me here today. As Nathaniel shared, I'm a co-founder and chief business officer at a company in the Bay Area called Centivax. I'll talk a little bit more about Centivax today during the call. But I mentioned that to say I'm not too far from you guys over in Mission Bay area. So it's great to be here. And if any of you guys would like to connect afterwards, would be happy to do that. So in any case, I will talk to you guys today a little bit about my journey into entrepreneurship, my book, and my company. And I think I'll leave some time at the end as well for some questions. So feel free to keep those in mind for the end. So first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story. So this is a picture of me back from my lab days. I did, as Nathaniel said, I initially studied chemistry and chemical biology at Cornell University. I had the opportunity to do several years of basic research, both at Cornell, Pfizer, and also following graduation at University of Michigan. And probably like some of you guys, I kind of hit that point where I was like, what do you do with a bachelor's in science? Or what do you do with a science education in general? And, at the bachelor level, I, was kind of dragging my feet on whether or not I wanted to apply to a PhD. And so I spent multiple years in the lab. And what I realized I really loved about science and basic research was that I could ask these innovative questions in research, whether it was about cancer or Alzheimer's or any other type of disease. Science and asking innovative questions had the ability, I realized, to create new solutions. But it didn't take me long to realize, and I'm sure many of you relate to this as well, that although academic research was really good at this innovation and discovery aspect, it could be sometimes less good at actually bringing those discoveries out of the lab and to the market where patients could actually benefit from them. And so I thought to myself, well, if I want to see translation happen, maybe what I should do is go to medical school and work with real patients where I can see the science actually impact them. And so I thought to myself, the fastest way to see if I want to go to medical school is to go be a medical scribe. So that's what I did. I became a medical scribe in internal medicine and I shadowed a physician throughout her appointments. And from that experience, I very quickly saw two things. Number one, that a doctor is severely limited as to what they can do for her patients based on the medicines that exist. And number two, being in internal medicine, we were seeing patients and really getting to see their whole state of care. So, whether they were cardiovascular patients, also, or oncology patients, or rare disease patients, we got to kind of be a part of the totality of care. And what I very quickly saw is that there were so many diseases for which we lacked adequate or great treatment options. And so this kind of showed me that there was this sided problem that existed. On the one hand, there were patients who desperately needed new medicines for these various diseases. And on the other hand, there were promising innovations in research labs that weren't always efficiently making it out of the lab into patients. And so I started asking myself, how do I bridge that gap? And so at this point, I'm going to take a quick pause from telling you about my personal story and talk a little bit about business. I'd be remiss not to touch on that. And so when I was an undergrad and trying to figure out what to do with my career, I had a lot of friends who were in the business school or minoring in business or something I never did. And I thought to myself, why would I be interested in business? Business is about money. I don't find money inherently interesting. I think science is more interesting. And I was right and also wrong because, yes, business is about money, but money is actually a measure of how good a business is at solving a real problem for people. And without actually effectively addressing a felt need by a customer, a business can't make revenue and that then can't make profit, can't succeed, can't scale, and so on and so forth. And so what you see on the screen is an example of non-biotech businesses that I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. And all of these businesses came to be because they were solving problems in new ways for people. And that is really the power of entrepreneurship and startups, even outside of biotech. So just to touch on a couple, obviously Uber and Lyft, lots of people living in cities couldn't afford to own a car. Public transportation wasn't always a great option. And so Uber and Lyft ride sharing, which sounded crazy at the time, came into existence and it stayed around so long. And although getting to profitability is another issue, the fact that it's been downloaded and used by so many people is the reason why they have such strong revenue and user engagement. And so this is just an example about how startups can solve really interesting problems for people in novel ways. And I realized that similar to that, biotech, i.e., startups in science, had the ability to solve that two-sided problem we just talked about before, where on the one hand, patients needed new medicines, and on the other, the lab, and especially academic labs, held a lot of novel and high potential innovation that wasn't always making it to the market and to patients. And so I realized entrepreneurship had the ability to actually bridge those two things. Um, So to convince you of that, I want to talk to you a little bit more about how typically developing a new medicine occurs so that you can see how powerful biotech can be in this very difficult ecosystem. So what you're looking at here is the development process of one new medicine. And so that medicine goes through steps starting from discovering preclinical, then IND filing, which is what you file with the FDA in order to start clinical trials. And then there's typically three phases of clinical trials: a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3. And if all of that looks good, then you can file what's called a new drug application, or if it's a biologic, a BLA. And if the FDA thinks all of that looks good, then you can market your drug. So there's a couple of things I want you to notice about this. Number one, let's talk about this number at the top, 4%. So for every 10 drugs that go through this process, 10 potential new drugs, only one is actually making it all the way to the end. That's a 4% success rate, which is a crazy low number for most businesses. Number two, on that same point, it's not just about making it from here to here. There's a high likelihood of failure at each of these steps. So just because you've made it through phase 1, you still only have a 60% likelihood of progressing to the next stage. And, from here, only a 35%, and so on and so forth. Second, the cost. So after progressing through all of these stages, the average cost of this whole process is $1.4 billion. There's a couple of things I want to point out about that number. Number one, that's in 2013 dollars. So when you calculate in for inflation, it's 1.85 billion in today's dollars. And in addition to that, this number doesn't take into account what we talked about before, which is this very high probability of failure. And so if you capitalize in the cost of those 9 failures for every 1 success, and correct for 2013 dollars, this number becomes 3.43 billion. That's obviously a huge number, because remember, you have to go through this whole process as a business before you can make a single dollar of revenue on your product. And lastly, this timeline at the bottom. To get through this whole timeline takes on average 10 to 15 years. That's 10 to 15 years before you can theoretically make your first dollar of revenue. And until then, you're burning cash. And so you don't have to be an expert in business to kind of summarize that and realize high probability of failure, high cost to get to revenue, long development timeline. Why would anyone ever get into this business? And so if you're asking that question, that means you're following along. And what I want to point out to you guys, especially because a lot of you I know have mostly science backgrounds, is that solid science alone is not enough to overcome the inherent difficulties in this process to bring a new medicine to market. And despite the fact that a lot of times the science is promising, even when the science does work, sometimes it's the business model that fails. And so the reason biotech is extremely powerful is because it provides different ways in which to provide advantages in overcoming the inherent difficulties of this industry. And so we're going to talk about that next. So in order to talk a little bit about the power of biotech, I'm going to tell you a story about the first biotech company, Genentech, which is especially relevant for you guys being from UCSF, because the tech that created Genentech, which is commonly thought of as the first biotechnology company, was spun out of Stanford and UCSF back in the 70s. So it's close to home. But like I said before, biotech is no different. For a company to be successful, it has to solve a real problem for people, often in a novel way. And so the problem that Genentech was going after is that, of course, without insulin, diabetes is a deadly disease. At the time, though, the only way they knew how to make insulin was to literally extract it from cow and pig pancreases. There's several problems with this, as I'm sure you can imagine. Number one, your body isn't made to break down and utilize cow and pig proteins, so there is a high potential of an allergic reaction that could occur. Second, there were supply limitations because you were limited to the amount of insulin based on how many cow and pig pancreases you could source. And third, of course, this wasn't really readily scalable. It was difficult to have enough supply. And so what Genentech did, the first biotechnology company, is they took this technology, which was new at the time, called recombinant DNA technology, which I'm sure most of you guys who've worked in molecular biology use all the time. And they thought, okay, this is a really interesting lab tool. What if we applied it to diabetes and created human insulin using bacterial cells. And people at the time thought this was absolutely crazy. This is a lab tool. You can't express a human protein in a lower level organism like E. coli. But they persisted. They raised money. They started a company. And over here is pictures from the early days of Genentech. And of course, they succeeded. And by 1982, only 5 years after its founding, Genentech already received FDA approval for its first drug, Humulin. And this was really significant for multiple reasons. So picture for a minute the last slide. First of all, think about how long that timeline was. And they were able to bring this drug to market in only 5 years. That's a huge deal. Compare that to the 10 to 15 on the last slide. Second, although we don't have an exact number on how much they spent, I think it's reasonable to estimate that if you're developing a drug in a lean company in only 5 years instead of 10 to 15, you're likely to be spending less money to get something to market. And this drug, more importantly, transformed diabetes treatment. It enabled consistency in quality and potency. It enabled large-scale quantity production because bacteria multiply so quickly and easily. And today, most notably, the life expectancy of a diabetic individual approximates that of a normal healthy person. And so this is just one example of how powerful biotech can be in order to translate novel research out of the lab and into tangible treatments. So to go back to my story now, I know Nathaniel touched on it a little bit. So I kind of was at this juncture trying to decide what to do. And I became very interested in the potential of business to bring all the innovations I had worked on in the lab to the market where people could benefit from them. So I went to University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Um, I had the opportunity to work at the venture firm called Arch Venture Partners. For those of you who aren't familiar, Arch is one of the most famous venture capital firms in biotechnology because not only do they invest in companies, they usually start them as well. So a lot of the big innovations from the last couple decades have been in part because Arch founded certain companies. So as an example, Arch founded Illumina, and Illumina, of course, revolutionized the efficiency and cost of DNA sequencing, which has enabled so many follow-on technologies. In addition to that, as Nathaniel touched on, I'm a co-founder and chief business officer at Centivax, and I had the opportunity to write a book and be on the Forbes list. But today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the book. The reason I wrote the book was because I realized that scientists, and especially scientists like you guys who are interested in translation, often don't actually have the opportunity to understand some of the basics about how biotech works. And I believe that as the scientists, who are the ones who are closest to the technology and have the ability to truly understand it, a lot of times scientists are the most well-equipped to be the one to carry the technology forward. But you can't do that without an understanding of business, which is often not a part of typical programs. Although, this one seems to be the exception, and increasingly PhDs have programming that helps support people in understanding these things. The second reason I wrote the book is because throughout my consulting and working with multiple biotech companies, I realized there was something that distinguished the scientific founders that succeeded and the scientific founders that failed. And that was the scientific founders that succeeded were able to undergo a mindset shift out of the academic science mindset and into what I'll call for the moment a scientific business mindset. And I called that mindset shift building backwards. And just to give you a quick overview before we go more into it, building backwards on its face sounds very simple. And in many ways, the idea is simple, but in application, it's much more difficult. In a discipline as exacting and detail-oriented as science, it can be so easy to get into the weeds and miss the forest for the trees. And in academia, this is great. This is how academic science works, and it's the reason we have a lot of different innovations. But academic science is kind of a learning discipline in many ways, in which you get to ask one question, and that question opens up 10 more questions, and then you can go down any of those different question rabbit holes as deep as you might want to go. And the end result of that, or the end goal, so to speak, is learning in and of itself. And that's really important. And we wouldn't have most of the innovations we have today without academic science. But that mindset doesn't work in a business, because in a business, your goal is to develop a product. And if you don't work backwards towards this end goal, your company might fail. Even if your science works, you might run out of money before you get there. You might not have the right talent. You might waste your time asking questions that won't allow you to proceed to the next step. And so I realized that this building backwards mindset was actually particularly important in this industry. And so that's what we're going to talk about next. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a case study about when people were able to build backwards very effectively. So this is about a company called Synovion. So Synovion decided to develop a drug for schizophrenia. For those of you who aren't super familiar with how schizophrenia works or how it's classified, schizophrenia is a serious mental disorder in which people interpret reality abnormally. It has two sets of symptoms, positive and negative. Positive being delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech, and negative being flattened affect, reduced speech, and lack of initiative. Many people cite the negative symptoms as actually more debilitating than the positive symptoms. And the theory here is that it's dopaminergic dysregulation that underlies the disease. So accordingly, existing drugs primarily target dopamine receptors, and all of the approved drugs currently target the dopamine DRD2 receptor and as the primary target. And while this receptor is very effective at alleviating the positive symptoms, it's incompletely effective at addressing the negative symptoms. And in addition to that, targeting this receptor produces a certain set of negative side effects that patients find very undesirable and somewhat debilitating. Therefore, Synovion, like I said, you develop a product with a problem in mind that you're solving. Synovion built backwards to a problem that they wanted to solve in the market. So instead of developing something and hoping that there was a market for it, they thought about what needs the market had, and they created a target product profile. So the two needs, if you recall what I just said, is they needed a drug that effectively treated negative symptoms. And second, they wanted a drug that did not have the negative side effects associated with blocking the D2 receptor specifically. So they built backwards from that end goal in order to find creative ways to address and create a drug for this indication most effectively and efficiently. And so because they did this, they saw the ability here to use a new technology, which was a phenotypic behavioral assay, in which they took novel compounds, hundreds of them. They screened them in animals. They used this technology to look at the animal's behavior to see if the negative symptoms seemed to be addressed. And from that set of compounds that seemed to address negative symptoms, they took out anything that worked without binding D2. So this was a very simple binding screen in which anything that bound D2 was then put to the side. From this, they came up with this drug candidate called ulotaront. And recall, this is a pretty interesting way to do it, as typically people do in vitro and then in vivo and not the other way around. So to tell you how that went, ulotaront made it all the way to phase 3, which is pretty notable. It demonstrated clinically in a phase 2 that it improved the negative symptoms compared to the placebo, lower rates of side effects compared to currently approved drugs that target D2, which again were the two things they were looking for. And when you solve a new problem in a new way, oftentimes the money follows. And Otsuka Pharmaceutical paid almost $1 billion for the rights to co-develop this molecule. Unfortunately, the molecule failed in 2 phase 3 trials in 2023. People are, claim that in neuroscience, they overvalue the placebo, and so the statistical difference isn't significant enough. Who knows? However, that's not the point. I want to make 2 points here. Number 1, getting to an answer only took 5 years. Number 2, making to phase 3 is a huge accomplishment. And despite whether or not this molecule ultimately succeeds, as I think they're running more studies on it, the point is, Synovion was very effectively able to build backwards to a molecule very quickly and defined a target product profile that resulted in a business success. And so there's a lot of things that we can learn from this. So at each step, the company proactively built backwards by looking for a place where they could use new technology in order to get to an answer more quickly, because they knew what questions they were trying to answer right away in their clinic. They knew what questions they wanted to prove in the clinic, and so they selected for compounds that would do that up front instead of going all the way through the process and wondering if it would work. And although you're probably wondering and thinking, a new technology like that wouldn't be useful for anything else, and you're right, it wouldn't, but that's not the point. The point is, by building backwards, you're better able to see where new technologies and innovative tools might be applicable because you know which questions you're clearly trying to answer. So by defining their end goal, it was likely easier to clearly understand where novel technology could be useful. They got to an answer very quickly. And building backwards is a very powerful tool to spur constant refocusing on an end goal. So next, I'm going to tell you a story about a company that did not build backwards effectively. In order for you to understand that, I need to tell you a little bit about how valuation works in a biotech company. So valuation is simply the value of a biotech company. And relative to non-biotech companies, where the value of the company kind of gradually increases in line with revenue, because like I told you, biotech companies don't make revenue while they're developing their drugs. The value of your company is it goes up in a stepwise function based on where you are in a stage of development. And so it goes up from preclinical to phase 1, to phase 2, to phase 3, to approval. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of spread here because, especially in preclinical, because what preclinical means can widely vary from, I have an idea to, oh, I'm in GMP and I'm about to start a clinical trial. So the point here is the implications for biotech, if you're building backwards, knowing that this is how the model works, is unlike in academia, where I've heard it said, time is cheap and money is expensive. In biotech and business, it's kind of the opposite. Time is very expensive. And money is cheaper. So what you want to do is increase the value of your company as efficiently as possible by spending capital strategically. So that means every piece of data you gather should increase the value of the company and also de-risk the probability of failure. And so in order to do drug development in a strategic way and building backwards, you want to advance through this process in a way that both progressively moves you towards drug approval while spending capital strategically. And so this requires a lot of discipline, especially for academic scientists who are, able to usually ask whatever experimental question is interesting to them. And so what happened here is this is a company called M Therapeutics that I used to work with. They were one of my clients. They were developing a new therapy for stage 4 cancer. And it was kind of an interesting situation. The work involved repurposing 2 previously FDA-approved drugs that were used in different indications. They combined them, realizing that the mechanisms were synergistic in terminal cancer. And uniquely, through compassionate use, which is a special mechanism FDA has, where normally you need to, go pretty far down the process to go into humans. The PI had already been able to take this into human patients through a compassionate use mechanism, which you can use sometimes in terminally ill patients. And uniquely, he brought a lot of them into remission. And so the reason I highlight those 2 points is when you're doing clinical trials, what you're looking for are 2 things. This is what FDA looks for. Number 1, safety. Is the drug safe? Number 2, efficacy. Does the drug actually work? And the highest type of data you can get is human data. And what was really interesting about this company is before they ever even started formal clinical trials, they already had some data to suggest, look, these drugs have been in people for decades and used safely. We know they're safe, or at least they're safe independently and probably safe together. And efficacious. They'd already been able to use it in human patients. They knew it worked. What does that mean for building backwards? It means that the questions they asked that were preclinical, because you still have to, do some preclinical stuff in order to file your IND and run a formal clinical trial. The questions they asked in order to get to the clinic should have been focused and particularly efficient in this case, because they already had so much data in humans already. And recall that slide before, they should have progressed as quickly as possible into that phase 1 value inflection point. And uniquely for most biotech companies, they had kind of this especially straightforward roadmap in order to get there. However, that's not what they did. The leadership was very academic, so they focused very highly on obtaining publication-worthy in vivo data over months at first and then years, so 5-6 years. To give you an idea, my company's only been around for about 4 years, and we're about to file our second IND, which is the second, again, the document you file to get into clinical trials. The company hired 20 to 30 full-time lab employees, which probably to some of you from academic labs doesn't sound that big. But remember what I said about strategic capital spending. When you're paying 30 full-time salaries, you're not spending that money on asking the toxicology questions. Maybe you're focusing too much on running the same experiment over and over instead of doing mechanism studies or DART studies, which are reproductive toxicology studies. And so they were spending a lot of money without de-risking or moving forward. And so in the case of M Therapeutics, overinvestment of time and capital into these preclinical experiments was likely not as productive as other activities. And what it resulted in, at each step, this company did not build backwards. And ultimately, after even 6 years post-founding, the company still had not gone into the clinic. And last I checked, it's still around, but it's kind of dying. And so what I want to impress upon you here is that while in this case, the science worked, we knew the science worked, we'd used it in people, the business ultimately failed because it ran out of money without substantially increasing the value of the business. And therefore, they couldn't raise a follow-on round and they couldn't progress. And even though the company's still alive, they haven't actually made progress. And at this point, it'd be very hard for them to succeed because investors look at it as, well, what have you been doing all this time? Why would I give you money now? And so this is a sad story, right? Because it's not just about a business failing. It's about a promising new therapy, in this case, a therapy that we knew worked in people, that wasn't able to make it to the market because the business model wasn't right. And if the company had built backwards to the product and where they were trying to go, they could have avoided this. And although it's definitely a good debate and a good discussion about whether it's a good business to start a company around previously approved drugs and reapplying them, that's not the point. What I want to highlight here is the fact that because they did that, in this case, it was a uniquely easy path in some ways, or straightforward path in the preclinical data in order to get into the clinic. And so if the company had built backwards, they probably could have at least continued to move on when they had human data. So at this point, I know we're getting short on time. I will touch a little bit on my own company, Centivax, and then we can move into questions. So Centivax is a company that focuses on broad spectrum universal mRNA vaccines, and it's a platform company. So the problem that we're solving is that viruses and pathogens mutate very rapidly. And what you're looking at here is the antigenic changes that occurred within influenza since 2006. And what you should take away from this is that there has been a lot of changes, and that's part of the reason why the vaccine doesn't work very well. The influenza vaccine is one of the biggest markets. It's $7 billion a year, but it's only between 10 to 60% effective, 30 to 60 on average, and as low as 10% on years in which the match between the existing vaccine and the circulating strain are most different. And of course, pandemics shift years. And so again, a good business solves a problem. And so we're solving that problem. And the way we're doing it is we're taking a mix of 18 diverse hemagglutinin proteins, which is the influenza spike protein. We dilute each of them down to a subthreshold dose such that in and of itself, one of them is not at a high enough concentration to activate a strain-specific B cell. So it's only the broadly neutralizing antibody producing B cells, the BNAb producing cells, if you will, that receive a high enough concentration of antigen to class switch, proliferate, et cetera, and activate the immune memory. So therefore, it's selecting for only B cells that recognize the conserved regions amongst all these shared components. And we've tested this very extensively in vivo. This is data we received in pigs, where compared to a 2007 seasonal vaccine, our vaccine protected not only against things from 2007 and before, but also 13 years into the future after 2007. And we've received early but similar data in coronavirus, which is a follow-on vaccine indication for us. So I won't go into too much detail here, but usually when we pitch this, VCs want to know about strong IP. So I say, yes, we have really strong IP, both on the idea and on the composition, and it's a multi-tiered levels of protection approach. We talk about the pipeline. I say it's not just a one-hit wonder. It's a platform technology, which means we can apply it to lots of different things, i.e., really valuable company. That's what you want them to hear. And then VCs often like to see the development path. So we just talked a little bit about this in theory. So here's a real development path in practice. So GMP is manufacturing. And in parallel, we do safety and toxicology. So this is some of the preclinical work I was talking about before. And then you can move into a phase 1A and a phase 1B, and ultimately into our case, a phase 2-3 adaptive trial. And VCs love to hear that you can get to the market faster, more efficiently, and for less money. So those are all things I highlight here. And of course, that means that you can more efficiently and quickly bring an important new vaccine to patients if everything looks good, which we think it will. VCs like to know about the team. So you usually have a slide where you detail everyone on the team. So an important thing is having previous experience. So our CEO previously built and sold a company. So you highlight that. Our CSO has a drug from Pfizer that she brought into the clinic that was named after her. Her name's Sasan. It's called Sasanlimab. Our CMO, Jerry, has developed 14 vaccines, more than any other person alive. It's a vaccine company, so they like to hear that. And multiple other team members as well, with extensive industry experience, and in my case, business experience. Same thing, strong board of advisors. Will highlight the fact that we have experts in manufacturing, because that's the step we're on. We have experts in clinical. We even have this person who is at the FDA for approving vaccines for 30 years, who is now out of the FDA, and he's a consultant, and he's on our SAB and works with us to make sure our regulatory strategy is in line with what the FDA will want. Talk about how this is a big advantage. So currently, they have to change the influenza vaccine every year. So it's this kind of crazy process where there's a different vaccine in the Northern Hemisphere versus the Southern Hemisphere. You only have a little bit of time to produce a vaccine. And if you get in too late for some reason, because manufacturing is delayed, you only have a short window to sell the vaccine. And then at the end of the season, you got to throw everything out and start again. And so it's this crazy process versus with our technology, you don't have to change the vaccine, and it'll address all future mutation. So it becomes a normal vaccine, just like the tetanus, chickenpox, polio vaccines that we get now, where you expect them to work and you get them in your primary care office every couple of years. So that's what we would be able to do for the vaccine market. VCs like to hear about paths to liquidity, because VCs aren't charity. They want a return on their investment. And so you talk about how the vaccine market is really exciting. There's high market cap companies that are comparable. There's big acquisitions that have happened in the space, and I touch a bit on that. VCs want to hear about the raise, and so I talk about the fact that we're raising about $70 million. It'll get us through the phase 1 clinical trial value inflection point, if you guys recall that chart with all the step-ups in value. And I say for us, phase 1 will be a particularly valuable value inflection point because it will give us efficacy, some measure of efficacy, and not just safety. Which is unusual. Usually phase 1 is just safety. And the reason for that is because with vaccines, you can draw patient blood and run a bunch of in vitro assays. And so you can see whether or not your vaccine is working very quickly. So it's a very important value inflection point, particularly for us. And lastly, we've raised lots of money so far. We've been very fortunate to raise almost $19 million in grant money. So that's not only from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also multiple different branches of the US government, which is a validation of the strength of our technology. Not only the NIH, the US Navy, it's also the US Army, DoD, Nimble, Midrip, and others, and also something from BARDA and J&J, which is really exciting because we'd hope to work with BARDA moving forward as well. And then we've raised some dilutive capital over here, about 16 million through a safe note as well as a formal seed round. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Thank you all for listening to me today.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephanie. That was really great. For folks, feel free to either raise your hand or use the chat function to type in your question. And as you guys are typing and thinking of your questions, I'd like to start off the conversation. So, Stephanie, the title of your book is Building Backwards to Biotech. And you talk a lot about building backwards. One of the things that we have the group of interns do later in the summer is to create a TPP, a target product profile.
Yeah.
And one of the way we like to present these TPPs to folks who've never heard of it is the concept of beginning with the end in mind. So
Yeah.
we see a lot of parallels there between beginning with the end in mind, what you want this end product to be, even before you've done some of the research and the science and the clinical trials that will get you to that product. So I'd love you to maybe chat a little bit, share with us some thoughts on target product profiles and how that's connected to this vision of building backwards.
Sure. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And that's in my book as well, in the clinical section, because it's a very important mechanism for building backwards. And the reason is, and I'm sure you touch on this as well, but the reason is if you don't have claims built into your clinical trial that make it into your end label, then you can't market on the basis of those claims. And so it's kind of like what I've been saying here. You want to bring something to market that's filling a hole in the market. And so if you don't plan for what that hole is ahead of time that you're proving in your clinical trial, then it won't be on your label, and then you can't market for the thing that you actually want. And there's all sorts of failures in the space where something happened where they didn't think of it in time, and so they didn't have the correct data in their clinical trial. I actually have a story about that in the book where it was Abbott at the time, they're now AbbVie, but Abbott hadn't built in a certain trial for a claim they wanted to make on the label, and so their drug basically completely tanked when it was on the market. But thankfully they were able to go back, this is kind of rare, and rework the data that they'd already had. And so they were able to add more onto the label, ultimately market the drug under a different label, and the drug succeeded, even though it was the same drug. So that's just an example of how important the TPP is, and thinking about which claims you're trying to make and how you're going to build that into your clinical trial.
Wow, very well said. We'll have to make sure all the PIs on these teams read the book so they know how important completing these are this summer. Any other questions for folks?
I think we have a
I
hand.
see a hand raised. Benina Cardoza, please.
My name's Naya, and thank you, Stephanie, for your really engaging presentation and breaking things down so it's really easy to understand. I was really interested in the case study that you presented with therapeutics, and I just wanted to know, in your opinion, is there any way to presently save those companies or the science that they succeeded in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's really, unfortunately, the way the industry works, because it's so competitive, it's sometimes really hard to get attention if you've been kind of a failing company for almost a decade, or at this point, I think probably more than a decade in their case. There's ways to overcome it. They're kind of business things you can do. So first of all, it's often really helpful to take all the intellectual property and put it into a new company, recruit new management. So they needed a new strategy. They needed to be building backwards and thinking about a strategy that made sense for them. Like I said, unfortunately in some ways, because it's a good for patients, but it's a difficult business model. It is a difficult business model to have drugs that you're repurposing. It's really important, but it's a hard business. And so perhaps in their case, they would have been more successful at starting this company in a different format, like through a nonprofit or academic grants or something like that. Although I will say the problem with that is then it's not very focused. It doesn't move as quickly, and that's kind of the advantage of business. So I don't have a perfect answer, but there are things you could do that increase the probability that they would have succeeded.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful.
There's a question from Finn in the chat. Finn, would you like to read your question? But if you cannot read it for whatever reason, I'm happy to read it out loud for folks.
Hi, yeah, for sure. So as first of all, thank you again. It was really inspiring to hear that, and also honestly, from a woman in STEM as well. But yeah, kind of as an undergrad, I know that I'm really interested in biology, but I think similar to you, I found that business is really crucial and really interesting, and I don't know if I'm like best in the lab. So I really want to end up on the business side of the bio world. But in that sense, what would you say are the most crucial skills and experience to gain really early in, one's career? And is it important in your experience to have, the depth of research, as, obviously it's still important to have the scientific background?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say, in short, it depends, but I'll elaborate. I think because you specified you're interested in being on the business side, it's a little bit less crucial, the details of your scientific experience. Although, of course, the more time you spend on the science, the more understanding you'll have. So I chose not to get a PhD. Some people do get a PhD and an MBA. I had spent probably 6-7 years in the lab, of course, not full time, but had kind of had pretty strong experience for my age at the time in the lab. So I felt pretty confident that I didn't want to keep doing it. But with that said, I understand a lot more because I did do it. So I think, you kind of have to make a decision on that front. I'd also say that experience begets experience. And so while it definitely is super helpful in this industry to have degrees because you're working with PhD postdocs or, MDs who have trained for decades post-college, it's definitely helpful to have degrees in general in this industry. So I'll just say that. However, degrees aren't everything. And I think a lot of times, especially people in higher ed, overemphasize the importance of degrees versus experience. And so here's what I mean by that. Experience begets experience. So once you do something once, or at least a couple times, it qualifies you in some ways to do it again. And so, for example, I've raised rounds of financing, right? And you don't go to school to get a degree in how to do that. You just do it. But then once you do it, now it's a line item on your resume that no one can take away from you, and you're able to do it again. And so what I would say is you want to focus on getting deal experience if you want to be on the business side. That's typically one of the most important things you can do. So, working in business development is if you can get in early, is a really awesome thing, as well as VC or being on the business development team of a company. As far as raw business skills, understanding finance and financial statements is going to help you. The other thing that's really important in this industry is communication skills. So as you can see, I just presented to you or talked at you guys for 45 minutes, and you have to do a lot of that in this industry to get money. And so if you're not a good talker or presenter or a networker, it's going to be a little bit harder. And if you can't communicate your science, then the science basically doesn't exist if no one can understand it. So you have to really work on communication skills and question answering and all of that. Some of it you just learn as you do it, but if you know you're particularly weak in that, it's something you could consider taking classes on or having a coach or something like that. And a very cheap way to get better at speaking, by the way, is to video yourself presenting and then force yourself to watch it back, take notes on what you should do better, and run it over and over until it's really good. And another way you could do it is watch YouTube videos of really inspiring speakers like MLK online and see some of the techniques used. Looks like there is some hands and some more questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, how about Vidisha, please?
Yeah. Um, so I was actually a little curious. I know there was you had a very good presentation, but I am actually still very curious to know about how this internship program is going to help someone who's interested to work in a biotech industry.
I think that's probably a better question for you, Nathaniel.
Yeah, thanks, Vidisha. As I touched on in the beginning of this, not sure if you had joined yet, but we're gonna try and focus mostly this talk with Stephanie. Much more information to come, specifically around the internship, next steps, logistics. Though at a very high level, this internship you'll be exposed to some fantastic UCSF science, while also working with them to take the next steps to get this scientific idea, the scientific project to a reality that becomes a product for both patient benefit and commercialization. That's the goal, and we're going to wrap you around with a bunch of different resources to get you there. All right, so let's keep the focus on Stephanie again. Stephanie, we're so glad you're here. To Charlene Wong, please.
Hi, I also appreciate your presentation. It was really informational. So from my previous experience, I was also a consultant for a medical company, and one of my biggest struggles was to find proper funding. Do you have any suggestions to find like something specific, or do you have any examples on how you found your sponsorships?
So it's a little bit different if you're raising money for a business, I would say, versus you said medical consulting. Was it for a hospital or was it for a startup?
It was for a startup involving an AI medical headband for stroke detection.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so similar. When I say biotech, I mostly focus on drug development, but it is similar in the sense of you still do some of the same processes, but oftentimes, it's not all the time, but oftentimes medical device is kind of a different group of investors than biotech investors, but it's a similar process. There's really no science to it. To find investors, you often need warm introductions, and often the best introductions you can get are from, if you don't already have investors, that's the best sort of introduction. The second best sort of introduction is from founders that they have already backed that are going to say, oh yeah, this person's great. I've worked with them before. You should back them too. That's another good introduction. The third good introduction is through your legal firm, because a lot of times the legal firms are working with these pharma groups on deals where they interface with them on behalf of their own clients. And so they have some credibility with the pharma companies.
Thank you so much.
All right, and Wei Chao.
Yes, that's me. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you for sharing the connections between good science and to business. And I agree with a lot of it in terms of having the business is very important in order to drive the science forward, because working in the incubators, a lot of the small startup, they have very good science, but they end up not having the funding to continue with the science. But in your presentation, you highlighted having big names for the board directors and leadership team is very important aspects in order to attract venture capitalists to invest in your company. And so if you, as a startup, how do you even attract the big names, right, from the leadership team or have them join your board director? That's one. And second, you also mentioned about the private versus public funding, right? So from a biotech perspective, what are the benefits that when you decide to go public fundings? And is it, I mean, besides raising more funding, is there any benefit to the companies in terms of the science, or is more pure of a business decisions?
Those are great questions. Let me start with the last one. Actually, could you repeat the last one more time?
Yeah, my last question is because on one of your slides you mentioned about there's the charge for private funding raising versus public, right? So I'm just curious, for when a biotech company make that decisions, besides raising more money for the company or more capitals to move forward with science, is there any benefit to the company itself besides getting more fundings, or like is there a benefit for the company to get more knowing? Because the reason I ask is because I think one of the company, for example, Lyle Therapeutics, a while back, I don't think they have any drugs or program like pipelines. They just found it for a really little short period of time and then went IPO right away. So what are the benefits of that versus you guys trying to raise money?
Yeah, that happened a lot in kind of the boom, the biotech boom, which is considered like 2020, 2021. And so, yeah, there's always lots of different considerations on whether to go public or not. So just for those of you who aren't familiar, so a type of fundraising you could do is going public. People think of it as a liquidity event, but it's actually a fundraising round to do an initial public offering. It enables you to be listed on the public market, and you raise money in the process, and then you can, in the future issue more shares in order to raise money from public market investors versus just private investors. And so it kind of opens up the investment abilities. And so there's lots of different considerations there. A lot of times in 2020, 2021, like I said, is people are just taking advantage of the fact that the market was so good. So you see a lot fewer IPOs right now for companies at such an early stage as Lyle, as you mentioned as an example. And the reason for that is because public market companies are not doing very well. And so it's a little bit difficult to have a good raise going public right now. But that's not to say that people aren't doing it. There have been, I think, a couple successful IPOs, at least in the last 6 months. But just to speak more generally and not talking so much macroeconomics, there's other considerations about whether or not to go public, which is that there's pros and cons. So going public means that you have kind of a path to grow a little bit more easily because you can raise, like I said, you can issue more shares once you're publicly traded, and you can raise more follow-on rounds without going to private investors. Additionally, you can, but the downside of going public is that you can be totally screwed over on your valuation by clinical trial results, or like sometimes your clinical trial results are even positive and your company gets shorted. And so now you're dealing with like public market investors, which can like make your valuation go up and down, which is part of the reason why people aren't going public right now. The public markets are just, kind of undervaluing companies based on their stage. You also get diluted a little bit when you go public, about 30%, because you're issuing new shares, versus you do get diluted as well, raising from private markets. But you don't know how your valuation is going to do once you start trading. Those are kind of the things that come to mind off the bat. I'm sure there's probably some others.
Thanks.
Thank you. But what about the follow-up of the one thing that you highlighted with like it's very critical to have big names or experienced leadership on the board. So how can you attract that before attracting venture capitalists?
I mean, it's kind of a dance, right? It's a little bit like a chicken and the egg. So I didn't necessarily say it's important to have big names. Obviously, it's very helpful to have big names, but that's not always possible. What's super, like, I wouldn't say the CEO is a big name. He's getting more well known, but initially, the most important thing that investors see when they look at him is that he's already built and sold a company. So it's previous success. So what you want to emphasize when you're recruiting a team and board members is just a history of success and a history of, being involved with drug development or the things that you're going to have that person doing. So for me, for example, I'm in charge of the fundraise, and it gives me a lot of credibility that I used to be in a venture firm. So that's one example. So it's a little bit less about the brand name, although of course the brand name is really nice. Yeah, so hopefully that helps. And then once you have one brand name, it kind of helps you get the second one, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. That was helpful. Can I ask just one last question about the science part of it?
Stay with me.
Yeah, so because you highlighted in the beginning for the charge when you go from early discovery to new drug applications, it's estimated of the percentage is very low, 4%, but the total amount spent is 1.4 millions. Is that more specifically for vaccine biotechs, or also include like gene therapy, cell therapy, small molecules, or it will vary depending on what the drug is and in terms of the timeline and estimates?
So you're asking about the timeline differences between those things?
Yeah, the reason I ask is because, for example, like cell therapies, from experience, they don't require NHP study versus gene therapy, it does require, right? So would that alter the timeline at all? And would that change the total amount estimate that you listed there, 1.4 millions, assuming that, or knowing that NHP study is really, really
1.4
expensive?
billion. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's an average number, right? So that's based on like an analysis of tons of companies. It's done by Tufts. You can look it up. It was done in 2013. And like I said, that's not really focused on biotech companies. It's focused, but biotech companies that's focused on the pharma industry in general. Of course, there's huge variance between what studies you do based on the moiety or the platform or the indication. So for example, for flu, you don't do NHP. That's not the golden standard. And in biologics, manufacturing is a really, really big cost item in your budget versus for small molecules. Sometimes it's much, much, much cheaper, but then the clinical trial is more expensive. And so it really, really depends. So you really can't paint hard and fast rules. And if you want to see more data, there is a standard deviation that I list in the brackets on that slide. It's in the book also. So if you want to go look at that, that's there too.
Yeah, all right, we have about time for one more question. I know we're past time, if that's okay. Before I do that, Hanji has a couple questions about IP, and we're not going to touch on IP so much today, but there will be a TPP workshop, an hour long, totally focused on intellectual property. So I'm going to pass it off to Pooja to ask your question, and then we'll wrap this up shortly.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie, for the wonderful talk. So I was wondering, what would be your suggestion, like the very first step for someone who has an idea of a startup but doesn't have a solid plan?
Well, the first, I think there's several steps you should take. And the first and most important is market validation, because actually most companies die before they even start because the idea isn't fundable or it's not going after a problem that's really in the market. It's going after a perceived problem. And so I don't know if UCSF has iCore, but that's a really good place to start, just to begin to think about whether your idea actually has a market application. And even if your first idea doesn't work, you'll start to understand how to do that market research, which is really helpful in the future. So my first thing that I put through iCore was crazy and didn't make any sense, but I learned a lot and it helped me, a lot since then. So, and I see Nathaniel put the link in the chat. So that's often a free program you can do, and it'll help you understand the market implication. So assuming that the market application. So assuming that it's something that could go forward and does have market application and potential. Second thing I would do is try and recruit co-founders, because it is very hard, especially if you don't have a PhD or anything, as a single sole founder, especially being young and not having industry experience. I could get away with it a little bit more easily because I was on the business side and I had very reputable scientific founders that had industry experience. And so one thing I'd highlight for all the scientists is a lot of times in academic institutions, professors think they know everything there possibly is to know about drug development because they have a very popular lab with a lot of money and awards. And I'd say not every academic lab professor has actual drug development industry experience, and VC investors view those two things as really different. So while it's really great to have a professor with innovative science and a Nature paper and, who's really well regarded in his field, you still kind of need to partner with people who have actual drug development experience. So remember on my team slide, there were several people who came from Pfizer. Our chief medical officer came from J&J and Merck, so on and so forth. So that's, I think, the second most important thing is to have that good team, because unfortunately that's usually what makes it enables you to get a first meeting and to be taken seriously, because there's a lot of noise in the space, and most of the noise is academic groups that don't really know what they're doing. So you automatically come across as more serious if you have some of that support.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Thanks, everybody, for all your great questions as well. Much more information about logistics and next steps on the Catalyst internship and all that will entail forthcoming. Again, on behalf of the UCSF, Innovation Ventures, the Catalyst Program, Catalyst Awards, and Catalyst Launchpad, Stephanie, thank you very much. We're so glad you're here. We look forward to continuing our relationship with you. And
Likewise, and I'd be happy to connect with anyone on LinkedIn or email. I dropped my email into the chat, and feel free to message me or follow up. Like I said, I'm in the Bay Area myself, so thank you for having me, and excited that so many of you guys are interested in biotech.
great. Thank you. And Stephanie's book, the link is in the chat. Everybody should definitely check it out.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.